Congruent polygons are polygons whose corresponding parts are all congruent. All right. When we talk about congruent shapes are just things that are exactly the same. Congruent segments had the same measurement. Congruent angles had the same measurement. But now congruent polygons are made up of segments and angles. So if congruent segments have the same measurement and congruent angles are angles with the same measurement, congruent polygons are just polygons made up of segments and angles that all have the same measurements, okay? And so it's really what it comes down to here, and one of the important things we have to do is we just have to be careful about how we label and name those things. We have to make sure we match up the corresponding pieces. And so when I look at this, you can see that like each side matches up with one side of the other polygon. And so when I look at this, like right here, this side has one dash and this side has one dash, which means that those two sides match up. Those are the corresponding pieces. In other words, when I'm comparing these congruent polygons, I know that AB, that side, is equal to side WX in the other polygon. All right. Likewise, if I were to look at something like AD right here, this side, notice it had four dashes through it. Well, that matches up with this side. So AD equals something like WZ, all right? So it's about just making sure it's labeled in a way that I know which sides are actually equal. Because when I look at like side AB is not the same as side, ZY, because they're not labeled as being the same. So I just have to make sure I understand which pieces match up, okay? Likewise, the same thing happens with the angles. Like if I were to look at angle B, one arc, well, that matches up with angle X. Those are congruent angles, all right? If I looked at like angle D, that has three arches through it, well, that matches up with angle Z, so now I know that angle D and Z are congruent, okay? So it's about making sure we match up the appropriate pieces. See, congruent polygons are made up of congruent parts, all right? And the important thing here is that I match up the correct parts so that I know how to label these polygons. And then going with the labels are important because they tell us about which parts matching up. So down here it says, must be named by corresponding vertices, which means, it just simply means this. If I were to look at that first polygon and call it polygon ABCD, I would say that that's congruent to, that's the same as polygon. Well, I just have to be careful here. I have to look at this and say, well, I called the first one A, B, C, D. So think about how that matches up. When I look at this, A matches up with W. So if I've labeled the first one starting with A, I label the second one starting with W. Okay. Next, I said AB. So B was this guy. Well, that matches up with X. So when I name the second one, I have to match it up. Okay. So I have to match these up based on these corresponding pieces. C matches with Y, so Y comes next. And then D matches with Z. And this is how I have to label it. So by saying polygon ABCD is congruent to polygon WXYZ, I'm also telling you which pieces match up. And just looking at the name, I can see that angle A matches with angle W. I can see that angle C matches with angle Y. Okay? Even looking at these pieces, I could say that, hey, segment CD, that piece is the same length as YZ. Okay, so I have to look at these things in terms of the corresponding pieces. That's what tells me they're congruent. And when I label these things, I have to label them in terms of the corresponding parts, okay? The label becomes very specific in terms of telling me which pieces match up, which pieces are congruent, which parts are congruent, which parts are the same, okay?